So we're going to talk about my book, Then the Rules Changed. And especially I'm going to talk about the story behind the story. So next slide, the book, and it's historical fiction. It's basically a Nebraska production. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. My illustrator who did the cover design lives in a town about 20 miles from me. The publisher has an independent press and lives about 50 miles from me. We live close enough together we can cooperate and work, and it makes the whole production quite easy. So the story told in the novel, it's a story of the experiences of a child whose family joins thousands of German-speaking immigrants from South Russia, and a part of what was South Russia is Ukraine. And they made this journey in the 1870s to the US and Canadian plains. So my interest in the story. My maternal great-grandparents immigrated in 1879 from Ukraine, from South Russia, the Ukrainian part of that, and the Molotchna colony within that. And they came to Kansas. Their son, my grandfather, was 9 years old when they made that journey. Very, very loosely, the main character of the story is based on him. My grandmother was 2 when her family came in a different year from a different colony, but to the same place. So just to get an idea of this, we have a map with South Russia, what's now Ukraine. The magenta colored places were some of the major Lutheran German-speaking colonies there. The blue are some of the major Catholic colonies there. The rest are red color, and we'll say they're that color because of turkey red meat, were some of the major Mennonite colonies. Now, there are more of each of these, plus colonies of other groups, but these are some of the major ones. So my grandparents, Carolina Hine and Peter Suderman. So he's the one who was 9 years old when the family came. So I started this whole thing in the early 1970s, when our family always had major family reunions. And there came the point at which people said, we hear the stories from the older people, they're passing on. We'd like our stories to be written down, at least some of them. And it would be nice to have a little bit of a genealogy with that. Family tree. So that sounded like a small but interesting project. I agreed to do it. But you know, you have some information here and you need a little more about it, so you get sent over here. But then that means that you have to include that person because they're related, but they're related to this one, so you have to include them. So 350-page book. The first half of it is a cultural history. The last half is a genealogy. The index had 12,000 names in it. This was printed in 1975. We didn't have computers at that point. We had one point at which, to make the index, the entire dining room floor became the place where our 4-year-old child could take these 12,000 index cards and pick out the first letter and start putting them down by first letter. And then the older kids could start going through and alphabetizing within there. And my husband, Ray, and my father could each be set up with a typewriter and start typing. And we got the book done. The main character of the novel is a 9-year-old. I gave him the name Isaac Jansen. This is fiction. That's not the name of a specific person. My criteria for choosing names to use was that I wanted this story to be something that not just Mennonites or Germans from Russia could read, but that people who didn't even know German or didn't have any connection to this could read. So I wanted to choose names that they could probably pronounce. That cut out about 3/4 of the German names. In the story, the specific culture is Mennonite, but it would be like the culture of any child in the 1870s from one of these German-speaking traditions in South Russia. I have had people say, "Oh, you wrote about that? Oh, then I know you are Lutheran." And somebody else said, "I didn't know there were any people who were involved in that other than people who were Reformed." That's the tradition that Presbyterians and others like that come from. At a book signing, a man picked up the book and looked at it. He says, "This is my story. My family came in, but we're Catholic. And it's my wife's story. Her family came in, and she's Jewish." And somebody else said, "Why did you leave out the Baptists?" And then I found out, and don't forget, there were non-German speaking Swedes who also came with them. Okay. So some of you know this historical background, that in 1762, the Russian Tsarina, Catherine the Great, invited Prussian farmers to what were called the undeveloped steppes of South Russia, part of which is Ukraine. Catherine the Great herself was a Prussian. That's now Poland. And undeveloped steppes meant it was pretty much like the plains when people started settling here. There were people there, but it wasn't cultivated land, so they called it undeveloped. To bring people there, Catherine said, "I'll give you these privileges. You can keep your language and customs. You can have autonomous control of your villages, schools, and churches, and you can be exempt from military service." Growing up around Mennonites, I thought that was specific to Mennonites. It was not. It was for everybody, and it was probably the most important thing that brought people there. Because if a young man was conscripted into the military at that time, it was basically a death sentence, not necessarily from fighting, but from the conditions in which they lived. Well, a century after Catherine invited people, her great-grandson, Alexander II, in 1870, revoked those privileges. And he said, and remember this line, he said, "German-speaking people will become Russian within 10 years." Now, he said that in the 1870s. About 1872, word of that edict reached most of the German-speaking colonies. The Czar himself was way up north in Russia, St. Petersburg. These people lived way down south. These people, most of them didn't speak Russian. It took a while for them to find out what was going to be happening to them. And then they scrambled to figure out what they were going to do about it. And then between about 1874 and 1880, there was this mass immigration out of South Russia, mostly to the Great Plains here. That's where there was land available. That's where they had invitations to come. So I'm going to introduce the story. The book is written primarily from third person. It's about this main character. But it begins with a letter from the main character to you, the reader. So I'm going to let you in on that. To you from Isaac, autumn 1879. That places it about 2/3 of the way through the story. Everyone knows how the world works. The Czar of Russia makes rules, grown-ups know the rules, and children must obey the rules if they understand them or not. Children live with their parents until they are almost grown-ups. Then they become apprentices and live with other people and work for them and obey the rules. That is just the way the world works. When the Czar changed the rules, grown-ups said we could no longer live in our German Mennonite way in Russia. I did not understand the Czar's rules or the grown-ups' words, but my life changed. For 5 years, people moved away from villages in our colony. My best friend left. This year, my family came to a place called Kansas, and the rules changed again. We have to do all the work, even work peasants did for us in the old country. A few days after we arrived, a man took away my 13-year-old sister, Lena. Maybe she was almost a grown-up. Another man took away my 12-year-old brother, Daniel. In school, I sit beside Peter Schmidt when he can come to school. He has to live 3 years with a man who is mean and makes him work like a grown-up. Peter is 10. I will be 10 on my birthday. Am I almost a grown-up? Will someone take me away? Isaac Jansen. So the next slide, the research for doing this story and for doing the Red Book. I read many chronicles, diaries, and letters of 1870s immigrants, not just from my family, but from many. I heard stories passed down by descendants of immigrants. There was information given to me by other people, and I made visits to museums and archives. So, examples of information from other people. My brother-in-law was on his computer. He found an 1879 New York newspaper article. There was a reporter who had said, all the stories we have about immigrants are from those who had money, who could be cabin passengers. What would it be like if you had to come in steerage? So this reporter went incognito in steerage across the Atlantic and then wrote a story about it. A very long story in this newspaper. That was a treasure trove of information. My husband, Ray, his family knew about the hardships of sponsorship. A poor family probably couldn't pay for all of the children to come. So they would find sponsors for the children who would pay the children's passage. And whoever sponsored a child, that child then worked for that sponsor to pay off the passage. So Ray's grandfather came over as a 15-year-old, and he had a sponsor who was not nice to him. And Ray's grandfather worked for 3 years for that sponsor in order to pay off the $88 passage. Visiting museums. Kaufman Museum here in Newton, a real treasure. One of the things they have quite a bit of is furniture. And furniture that illustrates decorative painting. This happens to be like a wardrobe, but a decorative painter started with the furniture that had been built out of whatever wood was available, usually inexpensive wood. And the painter, first of all, painted the grain of what the wood would have been if they could have used that. Then, after you had the grain and color of the wood you wish it were, then you put the decorations on. So in the story, Isaac wishes to be a decorative painter. He thinks that is an elegant trade. He doesn't like the other trades that might be available. Everyone saw leaves or scrolls painted on a man's carriage when he drove through the village. They saw flowers, grapevines, or birds on furniture, and painting that imitated the grain of fine wood. Painting was definitely more elegant than cleaning smelly animal hides to make leather, or pounding hot, heavy iron in a blacksmith shop, or being covered with flour dust in a mill. Isaac envied Cornelius. He could be a painter like his father. Isaac's father was a weaver. Isaac did not like the smell of wet wool or sharp edges of flax that had to be pounded into linen fibers. He did not like feeding mulberry leaves to noisily chomping silkworms or helping Mother and Lena unravel threads from stiff cocoons. He was an elegant trade. Tabor College has an archives, and they have a little museum associated with it. I found things there, and they were great help. The archivist there was great help to me. In fact, 2 of them. Next. In Nebraska, we have the Homestead National Historical Park at Beatrice, Nebraska. By the time these people came, there were sodbuster plows, but that cost money. And it cost money to hire someone who had one of those plows. The sod cutter was outdated, but you could still find an old one that had been discarded. If you were poor, you might use that. We went to Philadelphia, saw drawings and pictures from the 1870s when these people would have come right through that port. We went to Antwerp, Belgium, saw where they would have gotten on the ship. They wouldn't have seen that building. It was an older building they would have seen, but we saw the place where they would have been. One research that was easy was food. Most of you still have recipes that have been handed down generation after generation. So food is pretty easy. Food was a major concern for immigrants. You had, especially if you were in steerage, you had to take your own. And you had to have enough that it would last you for a train trip across Europe, a trip on the ship across the Atlantic, a train trip when you got to the port to where you were going, the Great Plains, and you got there and you still didn't have anything. Now, the food that my people brought was basically Zweiback. The way they brought Zweiback was to bake it 2 times so that it was nice and crisp and didn't have moisture in it and would keep. That's what you would find if you went to a grocery store. But if you were not making a trip like that, that's not what Zweiback meant. It didn't, the 2 didn't mean baked 2 times. It meant baked 2 together, one on top of the other, a double bun. Very practical. You can put twice as much in the oven. So for any of you who don't know what Zweiback looks like, this is what it looks like. And this is a very old picture, but my mother's hand making Zweiback. She has a big clump of dough in her hand, and she's squeezing out a little ball. Sets it down, and then the next one. And you get a tray full of that, and you poke a hole in the top of each one, and you put another one on top of it. Some of you are nodding your heads. To write this story, the seed that started the story, when I was writing the family history in the 1970s, there was one story about a boy who was named Isaac, who was 5 years old when they made the journey, who was lost in a train station for 3 days. So that story, I said, that's a kind of story kids could relate to. So that's been the germination seed. The book is historical fiction, and that does have its own challenges. There are historical and cultural terms that aren't familiar to all readers. So I used drawings, I wrote brief essays, and I made adaptations. So drawings. The drawings are embedded in the text. They serve as a pictorial dictionary. A term you might not know, there's a picture of it. Some of the things you will know, but I hope that the picture says to the reader, or makes the reader say, why is that picture there? So that the reader has to keep reading and find out. I had many, many photographs, and most of the pictures I developed by using those photographs. So when I say embedded in the text, here's a page from the book. There's a line that says, Isaac pulled off his woven reed shoes. What are woven reed shoes? Well, they look like that. There are some pictures I didn't know how to draw. My illustrator did those, but the big contribution that she made was doing the cover, and I think she did a marvelous job. She used those sepia tones from that period. She illustrates what the land probably looked like. She includes that Isaac wanted to be a painter. There's a drawing that he's made in the dust in the road, and he has a stick in his hand that he's used to make the drawing. But his foot is erasing the drawing, which represents that as the story goes through, as he journeys toward his new life, bit by bit, he keeps having losses. And so he has a sad facial expression. supplemental essays, some things you cannot show in pictures. So I wrote brief essays about it. So the next slide has one example. This is the essay on writing. But when this little boy is in South Russia, he has learned to read the German print in his reader, and he's learned to write those letters. He gets to this country, and a book is put in his hand that has English letters, and he's told to write like this. So just try to get an idea what that's like. All of a sudden, what you know doesn't work, and you have to learn something new. As far as adaptations, when you're writing about another culture in the historical setting, there was often little interaction, and it didn't matter which of those cultures you were from. There was little interaction between children and parents. Parents loved their children, they provided for their needs. But to interact the way we do today, no. Children didn't act or react with the parents for the most part. Their reactions were limited to what they observed, what they could think about or overhear. But today, a modern reader expects you to have dialogue, movement, action, interaction. So what did we do about that? Well, I added some small gestures that might not have been there. I let the mother put her hands on his shoulders. I let her touch his face. When I needed to explain things that today you would expect parents to explain, I let friends and siblings give the explanations. And I let the reader observe what the main character was observing and get in on the main character's thoughts. I sort of pictured like a theater stage, and there's action going on, but the main character happens to be off to the side, just knowing what's going on, but not being part of it for some of the scenes. What's been interesting to me are the connections between history and current events. So sometimes history and current events coincide. I felt like for me, they collided. I had written the first draft of this story in 1977. Life intervened. I picked it up and rewrote periodically. But in 2021, during the pandemic, I had the opportunity to do a novel workshop for children's literature, and I had the opportunity to just pick it up and do a thorough rewrite and final copy. And got a publisher, and the book was released February 24th, 2022, February 16th, 2022. 1 week later, February 24th, the Russian leader said, all Ukrainians are Russian. Remember that statement from Alexander? And the Russian leader invaded the exact place where this story begins. So this map is in the back of the book. This is a map of the Mennonite villages in the Molochna colony. So all the lines are rivers. You always put a village on a river. And all the little rectangles with names are villages in that colony. The interesting thing, there are 3 Russian villages or towns shown here. 2 of them pay attention to. One is Prishep, which was just across the river. There were colonies. I think Prishep was both a town and an area because there were colonies of Lutherans and others called Prishep. And Melitopol. And this is Sea of Azov. So we're going to go to the next map and put that in context. So here is a map with Ukraine. And the Sea of Azov is here. And right here, you can see that little point that was on the other map. And here is Melitopol. So that means that Molotchny colony was right here. So Melitopol, let's do the next slide. In the 1870s, Ray likes to investigate things about trains, and he found the train lines for 1870 for this place. So here's the Sea of Azov, here's Melitopol, here's Prishep, that other place I said to remember on the northwest corner of the colony. Well, that's as far in the 1870s as the train came. So everybody from that colony who wanted to get on the train had to go to Prishep. The train followed the Dnieper River, went up through Kiev, where the Dnieper River goes, kept following the river till it got into today's Belarus, then started west, went through Prussia, what's now Poland, Warsaw, Germany, Berlin. Some groups took a train line that went up this way and landed at Bremen and took the ship from there. But this group came on down to Antwerp. And then the next slide shows that when they got to Antwerp and got on the ship, then they came across the Atlantic, landed in Philadelphia, got on the train and came to the Great Plains. So the next slide will look familiar. So let's look at Melitopol again. It didn't take too long after that, and the train line was extended to Melitopol. By today, Melitopol is a railroad hub. From Melitopol, you can take the train north, like they did, but the train also goes east into Russia. The train goes west across Ukraine and into Moldova, and the train comes south into Crimea. And notice Crimea. Crimea for a while was part of Ukraine, but it's connected to the rest of it by just a tiny little isthmus. It has a peninsula that sticks out here, and there's a peninsula coming out from Russia, which makes a very tight little strait. All of the area of southern Ukraine and into Russia in that area was prime agricultural land. But if you want to get your products in or out, you have to go by ship, which means you have to get through this little strait, which means if you control Crimea, you control who goes in and out. Get out of the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea, go through another strait, get into the Mediterranean Sea, and go to the Atlantic. So, some comparisons. In the 1870s, that mass immigration was preceded by a Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. The Russians lost that war, but it depleted their treasury. So the Czar needed to rebuild the treasury. The Czar also wanted to refight the war and try to take Crimea back. So part of saying that all German-speaking people were Russian would be so that he could get the taxes and he could conscript the people. And so when he did that, there were uprisings all through Eastern Europe and Russia against the Czar. Well, this year, the war that is going on now was preceded by the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia has for a long time struggled economically, and there have been protests in Ukraine and other of the former Soviet socialist republics ever since before and after the Soviet Union fell. In the 1870s, South Russia was the most important area of Russia for agriculture. When the immigrants came, they brought their seeds and their know-how, and they made this part of what's the United States a primary agricultural area. Ukraine in current times has been one of the most important grain production areas of the world, an important exporter, fourth in the world in exporting wheat, first in the world in exporting barley. We've been hearing in the news about attempts to get that grain out. In the 1870s, there was the mass emigration of Germans from Russia and others that lasted through that decade, a little bit beyond. There have been other mass immigrations in the 1890s, in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. But in that 1870s, there were immigrants of several ethnicities, cultures, and religions. In current times, we saw a mass refugee flight, of course, in the first days of that war, and it continues. And in current times, the Ukrainian population includes nearly 100 different ethnicities. To my mind, history can come alive through stories. It's one of the reasons I write historical fiction. I think it helps bring history alive. It can come through remembering your history and passing your heritage on to the next generations. One of the most satisfying things to me have been the number of parents and grandparents who are reading this book, and then they use it to start talking with their grandchildren, sometimes their children too, but talking about their family histories, their stories. And many times I hear, this is the first time our family really sat down and talked about our history. That to me is one of the best things that can happen out of a book like this. Okay, yes, the book, the level of reading is middle grade. So for grandparents, you don't have to strain yourself to read it. And for the kids, it's accessible. I think that we can gain a lot about history and make it come alive through museums, such as Kaufman. The Kaufman Museum has so many things, that are mentioned in the book. They have a trunk and a travel hamper. They show the scythe and the wheat. They show the painted furniture. They show some of the clothing. I was at a convention where there was a woman talking about clothing. She works at North Dakota State University, and her particular field is textiles. She was giving a lecture on that, and she had my book there, and she kept going back to it and saying, when I'm doing research, I can find things about the elite. But this book keeps mentioning the clothing of the ordinary people. And so you can see a shirt at the Kaufman Museum. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about some other things you can see there. When I think about my heritage, I think about the 1870s, the story I wrote, and I think, okay, I know why people left then. But I listened to the news today. I know that there are refugees and immigrants all over the world today. And I think, what were the conditions that are compelling these people to leave their homes? We live in a country, in a time when we can say, well, people leave home for adventure. That's not true through almost all of history. That's not true for almost all of the world. You don't leave home unless something really makes you leave home. So what compels people to leave home? And what losses and fears do they face? Because these people faced a lot of losses and fears. And what difficulties do they encounter when they get to a new place? So I say every immigrant is first an immigrant. They have first left something before they go to something new. Isaac knows loss. He imagines a future. He has to face reality. And he's always facing fears. So just a few little things from the story. Loss. He's gone with his family to say goodbye to the grandparents before they leave on the trip. And his aunt has always lived with his family. And now they have said goodbye to the grandfather. They're ready to go back to their house and pack for the journey. And Isaac says, hurry, Tante Maria, we are leaving. Yeah, she answered, and I am staying. But how will you come to us for the journey? Isaac asked. I am not going, Tante Maria explained. You see how old your grandfather is, and he has no one to care for him. One of the losses of this relationship that he has always known. Imagine future. Father had only a few small fields going back from the narrow yard. He grew just enough for the family. Wheat, barley to roast for coffee, rye for bread flour and for straw to make hats, and hay for the cow and horses. Now they're going to the new country. They will have a farm. So Isaac says to his brother, Daniel, how big do you think our house will be? How many barns will we have? How many pig pens? How many fields and pastures? Will we have 10 servants? 25? Or even 50? How many houses will we have on our estate for them? Daniel had no answers. So Isaac imagined riding in a carriage with father to watch peasants work in their distant fields. He imagined servants to groom horses, herd sheep, and repair a tiled roof. And then they get to the new country. And he faces reality. The sod house was indeed old and abandoned. Holes in the roof let in both sun and a sudden summer shower. Insects flew out of grass in the walls where the mud plaster had fallen away. Mother cried and said she wished they were back in Russia. Isaac wanted to cry too. This sod house was nothing like the house he had imagined. Russian peasants had better houses. And he has throughout the book faced fears. You heard his first fear in his letter to you. Will someone take me away? So now he's been in this country for a while. It's into the winter. It's cold. There's butchering going on. The family heads out each morning to the next farm to help with butchering, but he has to stay behind and do some chores before he goes to school. Each morning, Father told Isaac to finish the chores as the family left for that day's work. Chores were always the same: fetch water and cut grass for the stove. Cutting grass was difficult now. When they first came, the prairie seemed an endless sea of tall, waving grass. But Isaac and Father had cut the nearby grass. He had to go far up the road to find some that was easy to cut and carry home. He grasped a handful and chopped it down with his knife. A noise alarmed him. A man on a horse rode toward him. The horse stopped. Herr Nickel peered at him. In a flash, everything became clear to Isaac. Herr Nickel was a landowner. Big landowners did not work like tradesmen or farmers. They watched others work. As a landowner, however, Herr Nickel had money. He could pay the passage of a boy and make the boy work like a peasant for him. Now Isaac understood. Now he knew. Herr Nickel was the one who would carry him away. Herr Nickel leaned down. His hand reached toward Isaac. Isaac wanted to run, but he could not move. There was no place to hide. There was only Herr Nickel leaning down, reaching toward him. There's about 20 more pages of story. I'm working on the next novel. I just came from 2 days of research in Oklahoma. The next novel will be set there. The brother-in-law of my grandmother, Carolyn Zeisset, made the 1893 run into the Cherokee Strip. One of my grandmother's brothers moved from Kansas to Major County near Fairview, Oklahoma in 1895, and her other brother made the same move in 1899, and her parents made the same move the following year, or in 1910. And we have people here whose grandfather made the same move. I don't remember what year, but it had to be before 1897 because he was married in that year, and he probably was there getting settled before he got married. So the next story is set there in Oklahoma. The main character in the next story is the daughter of the little boy in this story. And the story is about what it was like to be a child of a German-speaking family during World War I. So, what I'm hoping to get done. I have a website where you can get more information. And I thank you for coming, for your attention. And if you have questions or comments, I need to talk about the booklet. And I need to talk about, okay, bring me one of those. I said that museums are a great place to make history come alive. In cooperation with the Kaufman Museum, we have, well, it's a booklet. It's not quite in booklet form, but it's a booklet with quotes from the to that quote and questions for looking at those items in the museum that help make connections to today. So you are welcome to take these and take it with you to go see items in the Kaufman Museum. If you have children or grandchildren, take them to see them. If you know teachers, help them know that this is there. We'll have some of these available at Faith and Life Bookstore, so that if you buy a book there, you can get one of these and make your way right out to Kaufman Museum. We also have worked with Fern Bartle from the Mennonite Heritage and Agricultural Museum in Gossel. She has a little booklet that also connects these things with that museum. And the museums, there are several in Hillsborough, are also working with us. So there's a lot you can see in this area. Mm-hmm. So enjoy those.
If you go to Fairview, there's a museum there with booklets.
Oh yes, Fairview, Oklahoma has a museum and they have booklets that connect it. So, and Faith and Life Bookstore has brought books so that they are available to you tonight, and I will be here.
Do we have some questions? And those of you on Zoom and on Facebook, you can type your questions, and I'll pose them to Carolyn. Any questions?
What community did your great-grandparents come to?
Hillsborough.
Hillsborough, okay.
Mm-hmm. The community my great-grandparents came to was the Hillsborough community, about 4 miles south. About half a mile from where Lee Suderman over here grew up.
I enjoyed the book for many of the reasons that you have stated here. And I was curious as I read whether you did any research to find out whether there were indeed real people who might accidentally be named the names of you.
Are there any people who might accidentally be named the names I've used? I'm sure there are. And in fact, I've been told about another one of my cousins. His wife told me that she has an Isaac Jansen in her family. The names, and there is an essay about names in the back of the book. The way names were passed on. You have the same names over and over. So it's about impossible not to have somebody with that name. When I was writing this book, my mom and I went to a church where there were some records, and there was one rather unusual name. Adelgunda was the name of my great-grandfather's mother was Adelgunda. So as we were going through church records, we would find Adelgunda or Gunda. And my mom got to where she said, "You want me to write down every one of those? Do you think they're all related?" There were 17 of them who were all related.
Let's see, someone on Zoom said they enjoyed the presentation very much and asked if the book's in the library. I know we have a copy of it. I just checked our catalog and I don't see it yet. So that should be, it's in our technical services department, and I'll give them a nudge to get that processed ASAP so we can start circulating that here at the library.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, another question. Where do I live now? Lincoln, Nebraska.
I knew you a long time ago. My maiden name is Finley.
Aha! Yes, your mother was my piano teacher.
Of course she was.
Your sister, is she still?
My sister Marilyn lives in Maryland.
And she's married and has a family.
Oh, she and her husband live there.
Was it Edna Suderman that was your piano teacher?
No, it was Ruby Findlay.
Oh.
Her mom. Well, I will be here if you purchase books and want them signed. I'm willing to do that. And I do thank Bethany Martin for being here and bringing books. And if you decide you don't want to carry it home tonight, but you can go to the bookstore and get it. Or if you're in Gossel, you can go to the museum and get one.
All right, thank you.